So once again, everyone is welcome to another seminar under the auspices of Institute of African Studies Seminar Series. Today we are launching Mario Nisbett's book under the chairmanship of Professor Adomako Ampofo. Professor Adomako Ampofo is a professor of African and Gender Studies and former director at the Institute of African Studies. She was the foundation director of the University of Ghana's Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy. Adomako Ampofo is president of the African Studies Association of Africa, an honorary professor at the Center for African Studies at the University of Birmingham, and a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her ongoing work with Kate Skinner at the University of Birmingham, an archive of activism, gender and public history in post-colonial Ghana, includes a documentary entitled When Women Speak, directed by Ashe Tamaklo, and that was launched in January 2002. She is editor-in-chief, Contemporary Journal of African Studies, and co-editor, Critical Investigations into Humanitarianism in Africa blog. Join me in welcoming Professor Adomako Ampofo, who will pilot the rest of the affairs this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mba, and good morning, everyone. Hello, colleagues from different time zones, maybe good afternoon to some people, and very early morning to others. So you're all very, very welcome, and I'm pleased for us to have this, this gathering today. I will first introduce our speaker, and then he will have 20 to 25 minutes to share from his book, and then I will introduce the discussants, who will have about 10 minutes each. If they take less, we will not be averse to that idea. And then we'll open the floor for comments and questions and a conversation with the rest of you. So let me introduce our speaker. So Mario Nisbett was educated at the University of the Virgin Islands. He had his Bachelor of Arts from the University of the Virgin Islands, and then Morgan State University, where he had his MA. And finally, the University of California, Berkeley, where he had another MA and his PhD. He's currently a lecturer at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. He has work experience in various capacities with several universities in the United States, Jamaica, and Kenya. He has presented his research at the African Studies Association for Africa, and I should alert you all that I am the immediate past president, no longer the president of the ASA. He has also presented his work at the Caribbean Studies Association and other academic meetings in various American cities, also in Jamaica, Grenada, and here in Ghana. Through subcommittee membership in PANAFEST, he has assisted with collaborative activities with other universities in Ghana, the United States, and the Caribbean. As an interdisciplinary scholar, he teaches, researches, and writes in the areas of African and African diaspora histories, diaspora studies, diaspora theory, Pan-Africanism and slavery and resistance. His research interests also include interdisciplinarity, critical epistemology, sovereignty, development and post-development studies, and Africana political thought. His publications are available through journals such as Symbolism and our own Contemporary Journal of African Studies. He's the author of The Workings of Diaspora, published by Lexington. And today he's going to speak to us on his new book, which looks at the Maroons. And this book I have not read in its entirety, but I imagine that we're going to hear about the Maroons of Jamaica beyond the usual resistance to slavery discourse, which is important, and beyond the links to Africa discourse, the cultural links to Africa discourse, which is also important, and that we are going to hear a lot more about diaspora politics, a very important ongoing conversation. This is diaspora politics, obviously is not a new conversation, but it's taken on a new meaning, I think, in the times that we live in. COVID has made it even more cogent for us to do so. And for those of us who live on this side, the African continent side, I think that having, pulling us into those conversations is extremely important, because in as much as we talk about it and know about the importance of these diaspora politics, we tend to have, less of the kinds of deep insight that I believe we are going to get this morning. So Mario, over to you. We are looking forward to hearing more about your work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I would like to thank the Institute of African Study, the chair, the discussants, and also all people involved in the organization of the book talk. So thank you and welcome. And so I will go straight on in terms of and delve into what the book is about. The book started as my dissertation project in grad school, and eventually it was transformed into a manuscript, into a book. So the goal of the book was to explore how diaspora is practiced and lived in African descended communities. And I focus on the Jamaican Maroon communities to go into details in how this process works. So I will share the screen with the audience in terms of the PowerPoint presentation. So I hope everyone can see the screen. Yes, okay, so I would basically talk about the book in terms of how it's broken down into different chapters. So the entire book is about 6 chapters, and it starts with the introduction. And so for the introduction, I started exploring how the issue of diaspora was framed, and in terms of looking at scholars going back as far as Equiano, Amy Garvey, Du Bois. So there was this idea of a diasporic framing before the concept itself was used. So what I wanted to do is look at how different scholars, African scholars, people of African descent, Africans, look at the idea of diaspora. So I looked at Joseph Harris, Colin Palmer, Zaleza, Stuart Hall. These were some scholars that theorize and look at diaspora. And there was something unique in many ways in terms of how these different scholars look at diaspora. And so I attempted to refine how we see or understand diaspora. And I posit the definition of diaspora, the African diaspora, not just diaspora, as African diaspora is the condition that produces the shared consciousness of sameness rooted in the idea of a common African origin based on the idea of the experience of Black objection. So what I try to do also too is to look to see not what diaspora is, but what also scholars talk about, like how does diaspora work? And so the work explored the working of diaspora and look at it as an analytical tool. So the book tried to see how, the book looks at how Black communities, and I'm arguing that different Black communities, as I said earlier, engage 3 concepts that previous framing and meaning of diaspora usually focus on 3 things, and they were the issue of objection, the issue of common origin, and the issue of collective consciousness. So the book is broken down in many ways to reflect that view and that analysis. So in the second chapter, I moved to looking at the Maroon communities and looking at the issue of, particularly looking at the issue of sovereignty. So I look at the origins of the Maroon community in rebellions against the Spanish and English during the colonial period. I also explored a treaty that they signed with the British in the 1730s, late 1730s. The communities that I looked at or focused on were 5 communities, and these 5 communities are the most prominent Maroon communities that existed in Jamaica, but by all means is not the only Maroon communities in Jamaica. So these communities were what is referred to as Akompang, Charlestown, Moatang, Skatsal, and Tralanitan. So within that chapter, I gave a sense of broad history of Maroons and their development to give context to the other parts of the book. So chapter 2 looks at the issue of Black objection. And so when I speak of Black objection, I'm speaking about or talking about the attempts of Europeans to banish African from the domain of humanity. So it's the issue of the dehumanization of the African. So some scholars would argue that this is the initial phase that started Africans turn to the diaspora, those in the diaspora turn to the concept of diaspora itself. So within the chapter, I explore the colonial state and its apparatus in terms of how it created these colonial societies in Americas. So within these colonial societies, which were all started by white supremacists, they control the legislative, executive, and the judicial branches, and they created a society to reinforce this objection of Africans and inequality. And I went through a lot of publications that were published during that time period, particularly the local and international press, and explore how this framing of Blacks being subhuman was done, how Maroons' framing of being subhuman was done. And then in the latter part of the chapter, I look at the prevailing early Western thought in terms of who is human and who is not, who is deserving of having rights in society. And these philosophy really underpin how these societies in Americas were organized. And these are all of the societies in the Americas were created by true white supremacy, by white men. And so 300 years of this construct of this society produce certain outcomes, even though many of these philosophies or laws are not directly implemented, they still have manifestation in these societies. So then I went to the third chapter, looks at origins. So within this chapter, I try to look at how Maroons trace their origins, look at how do they look at their oral tradition in terms of where the states, how they state where they come from and how and why, and in what period, given the time period. Sometimes they stress other places of origins, but of course, most Maroons connect to Ghana or the Gold Coast in terms of ideas of origins. So I not only looked at the oral tradition of how Maroons make these connections, because many scholars have looked at this in terms of the Maroons, in terms of how they are connected to Africa, but in particular, I wanted to look at how Maroon produced those connections, and not only in oral tradition, but also intangible cultural forms. So this is in terms of their language, their political system, their land tenure system, their spiritual system, storytelling, song, ceremony, how they actually live this idea of that origins. And then I also look at tangible ways that this connection also manifests itself. So in the naming of the different communities, so the community is known as Akompang, which I will be elaborate on later. It is believed that it was founded by Achompang, who is a name that is popularly known in Tree, but because of the English influence, it's referred to now as Akompang. And then we also have Kojotang, which also have roots in Akan naming traditions. So they also have some communities in terms of secret sites, seal grounds, African burial grounds. They have the instrument of the beng, the gombe, and also structures such as the sofa yard and the shanty hut to give meaning, tangible meaning to this idea of origins. So what I try to do also look at is they have different theories that come out of academia in terms of survival, transformation, and issues of transatlantic dialogue. So all of these different theories Maroon communities in different ways actually, they depending on who they're speaking to and the audience and the time period, they might highlight certain things over others. So sometimes they will talk of things of African continuation, sometimes they will speak of African transformation, and sometimes they speak of African dialogue. But throughout the community, there are different ways of making these connections that I explore in the work. And then for chapter 4, I explore the issue of collective consciousness. So I looked at how Maroon communities internally make connections among themselves to collectively unite. And so this is often in a concept that the Maroons refer to as Kinda. And Kinda is seen as the coming together is an African word for the Maroons that means one family. So it was the coming together of different groups of Africans. So we are not only speaking of the Akans, but they also speak of Igbo or Congo or Mandingo people also came about to form the Maroon communities, but the Akan group, the Maroons would argue are more influential in this particular time. There are other times where sometimes, in fact, Igbo sometimes was stressed, other groups were stressed, but in today's term, it's often Akan. And so Maroons also make connections to linkages to other people of African descent and outside of the continent and inside the continent. So Maroons are positioning themselves today as a site of pilgrimage where people of African descent and Africans could come to see an African community that exists in the Americas and still flourish. It's 300 years old. It was established in the 1700s, and Maroon argues that they were the first independent community in the Americas. They were there before independent community in the Americas in the modern era, I must say. And because they had indigenous people living in the Americas, of course. So they see themselves as the first independent community in the Americas of African descent. And they also believe that they also became independent before the United States did, and they became independent before the Haitian Revolution, and became independent before many of the countries in the Americas gained their independence. And they see themselves as ambassador of independence. And so they have traveled to different parts of the Americas and the continent itself, in terms of even Ghana and other places on the continent, and see themselves as a means of Africans uniting together through collective consciousness. So the 5th chapter look at 70 claims. So based upon Maroon's experience of Black objection, experience of origins, and experience of collective consciousness, Maroons see themselves as sovereign groups in Jamaica. The group that I looked at the most was the Jamaican Maroons. So the Maroons argue that they existed in pre-colonial African kingdoms on the African continent. And when they were enslaved in the Americas and Jamaica, they liberated themselves from the plantations and recreated, re-established these African kingdoms in the mountains of Jamaica. And they fought the British for 80 years. And the British eventually made a treaty agreement with them. And the Maroons would say it wasn't that they came to a truce, but the Maroons would argue that they defeated the British Empire and brought them in terms to agree to a treaty, to agree to their existence. So the treaty for them was an acknowledgement of their sovereignty, not necessarily acknowledgement or creation of the Maroon communities themselves, what have often been portrayed in many scholarly writings. So the Maroons also have a social political system where there's the Maroon Council. And for Akampong, at the time I conducted the interview, there were mainly 3 different councils. There was the senior council, there was a junior council, and there was the Maroon full Maroon Council. So this council is used to govern the community. Akampong, which is one of the 4 communities that exist in Jamaica, they actually started having an election in the 1950s. And every 5 years or so, they have an election and new people come into power. The other 3 Maroon communities, they are more or less the Maroon leader usually serve for the remaining of their lifetime unless the community seek to remove that leader from power. But Maroon communities also speak about having communal lands. So you have in Jamaica where the Maroon communities, some of them have full control of the territory that they are residing in. And they do not pay taxes to the Jamaican government, and they consider themselves autonomous, and that Jamaicans government would need permission to come into the community and different things like that. But however, that varies from time to time and varies from place to place. But however, the Maroons have claimed that they have, for example, the Akosua Maroons, they claim that they have control the western section of Jamaica, which includes an area called the Cockpit Country, which is a unique vegetation, a unique area in Jamaica that has unique vegetation. And also there's issues in Jamaica, in current Jamaica today, in terms of where bauxite is being mined in the region. And the Jamaican Maroon community, particularly Akampan, which resides in that area, is challenging the Jamaican state and foreign interests such as the US government, not the US government, US private company, and also Chinese companies that are interested in mining bauxite in Jamaica. They are challenging them in terms of how the land should be used or not used. So the Maroon community also has a unique in terms of environmental view, which they also tie to their African origins. They see the land in the sense of it belongs to the born and the unborn. So the Maroons believe that if you are going to use the land, we have to consult not only the ancestors, but we also have to consult everyone living in the community, everyone who's a part of the community, and we have to think about the unborn generation, how whatever we do would impact them. So for the Maroon, the community is multi-generational, and it's also include the living and the non-living. And so this is in many ways in conflict with a lot of the capitalist point of view of many of the states in the Western Hemisphere, including Jamaica. So within the Maroon communities, they also have a constitution. It first came about in the 1940s, and attempts were made to work on the constitution in the 1990s, but it was in the early 2000s where they created a constitution that is fully known in the community. And there is a recent new leadership in Jamaican Maroon communities, Akampan, where they recently redid the constitution, and it was published about a month ago. So they also have a flag, and about a few years ago, there was a bank that was established in Jamaica, and that bank that was established in Jamaica, in Akampan, the Jamaican state had some issues in terms of the bank. They also created a currency, which also caused some arguments within the community in terms of the issue of currency, but also to the issue of the bank was something that was also of issue in the community, where the Jamaican state was saying that the Maroon community shouldn't have a bank because it's not, it should be reside more in the Jamaican state. And many members in the Maroon community argue that the Maroons are sovereign, so they should be able to have whatever currency they want, they should be able to have whatever bank that they want. And so this issue have become a big issue in Jamaica now today. So today in Jamaica, there's dispute between the government and Jamaican Maroon communities in terms of they are certain the idea that they are sovereign communities in Jamaica. So, so I covered that in the 5th chapter, and then in the last, before I go to the last chapter, so this is a chart. I was trying to put the information of the Maroon leadership from going back. So the records go back to the 1720s of Maroon leadership. So there's some dispute in some areas in terms of who ruled at what particular time, but also there's some issues in terms of the earlier part after Akampan. There's some dispute, but starting in saying the late 1800s, it's very clear of who were the leaders and when they ruled in that particular community. So some of them ruled for a very long time, or in the early part, but in the 1940s, as I mentioned, they started to have elections. So some of the leaders were re-elected, while some only spent a short time in power. And so my research only went up to Farron Williams, who was the colonel of Akampong. This is one of the communities in Jamaica, and they had an election in 2021, and so in 2021 a new leader was elected, but my study didn't enter into the new administration, but ended up this particular administration. So within his administration in particular, so the Maroon government actually also has, so the former government had a website page, and so this information was taken from their website page, where it had information about the government and information about the community. So within this one, he had the colonel himself, or the chief, and also to the deputy chief and the deputy colonel. And then this chart has the different leaders for different division within the government of the community. So this kind of governing, although it's the titles have changed over the years, but going back, even in the 1720s, even in British documents, they talk about the Maroon Leadership and the Maroon Council and the different members and their different responsibilities. So it has changed over time, but those institutions have remained in the Maroon communities up to today. So in conclusion of the chapter, I basically spoke about, I basically argued that different communities of African descent engage the concept of the African diaspora in distinct ways, and how these communities engage the African diaspora and its core components, particular objection, origin, and shared consciousness, informs the mean of emancipatory politics towards the ultimate goal of total recognition of the full humanity of people of African descent. So I argue it varies in time and place and space, but this definition that I'm proposing and something that I'm working on it could be also used as an analytical device to reveal how different communities engage this idea of diaspora. And for Maroon communities, how they engage the idea of diaspora is often through the issue of sovereignty in terms of what is the ultimate goal in terms of liberation. So this becomes complicated and a contentious issue where the issues of Maroons are autonomous or sovereign from what, and what is the relationship with Maroon community in an independent Jamaica that is predominantly of people of African descent. So this is a debate that is going on in Jamaica today, and it's something that I think perhaps will come up in our discussion. So I will end here, and I thank you all for listening to the presentation and introduction of the book.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Nisbett. That was fascinating, edifying. I feel that it's unfortunate that we are not in a physical room where we can actually hold the book and get signed copies, but that time will come. So I will now move to our discussants. I will introduce all of them right now, and then they will speak in the order in which I have introduced them. So our first discussant is Dr. Mjiba Frehiwot, who is a research fellow here at the Institute of African Studies in the History and Politics section. And her research and teaching interests primarily focus on Pan-Africanism, decolonizing knowledge production in global Africa, and made in Africa evaluation, and the African diaspora. And I'm keeping it short for each of you, forgive me, so that we can have more time for our conversation. Our second discussant is Dr. Edem Adotey, who is a senior research fellow here at the Institute of African Studies, also in the History and Politics section. He's an historian, and his primary research lies in the area of African borderlands, particularly the Ghana-Togo border, on which he has written quite a lot. His works have also examined the intersection between borders and chieftaincy, electoral politics, Borders and Nationalism and Pan-Africanism. And our third discussant is Michael Thomas, who's an Alexander von Humboldt postdoctoral fellow at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin. He's also an assistant professor of philosophy and coordinator for Africana Studies at Susquehanna University. His research explores the aesthetic dimension of social life, investigating the use of aesthetic experience for theorizing empirical and social relationships and the construction of societies as a collective aesthetic endeavor. He has published work in philosophy and literature, social theory, the critical philosophy of race, and North American studies. So thank you to the three of you, and Dr. Mjiba, over to you now. If you could take about 10 minutes for your discussion, would be grateful.
Thank you very much, Professor Akosua, Adomako, and Ampofo, for that introduction. And I just want to thank everyone for coming to this book talk. First off, I want to congratulate Dr. Mario Nisbett, who I've known for a long time, on this amazing text about the Maroons. One of the things that struck me the most about this book is its complexity, right? As well as its ability to take this analysis and really methodological stance or a new method, right, to analyze the diaspora. And so these are some of the things I was thinking when I was reading this book, both about the significance of the Maroon communities in Jamaica, but also about how we can use what Mario did to analyze African communities throughout global Africa. So I was very excited to read the text and to be here. I have a couple of points and I'm going to run through them, and I have set my timer because I talk longer than I should. So the first point that stuck out to me, which is really one of the first things that you read in the introduction, is that Maroon communities are the oldest independent political spaces in the Caribbean. And I think that this is particularly important because often when we think about the Maroons, we think freedom fighters, we think folks that push back against colonialism, we think cultural connections to the African continent, but we rarely think about political spaces, right? We rarely think about sovereign political spaces. So I think that this is a particularly important point, that these communities are the oldest political, independent, and sovereign spaces in the Caribbean. And this is something that one should begin to examine when we're looking at resistance against slavery. How many of those forms of resistance transition to being independent political spaces? Something that Mario mentioned in his presentation, but I think it's worth re-mentioning, is this innovative approach to the definition of diaspora. And for the sake of thinking through why it's innovative, I just wanted to go through it. He says, the African diaspora is a condition that produces the shared consciousness of sameness, rooted in the idea of common African origin, and based on a common experience of Black objection. He says there's three key elements: collective consciousness, which comes out clearly in this text, common origin, and objection. And I would also say, he also said somewhere throughout the book, this question of resistance against colonialism. So I think that this is a particularly important point around defining the African diaspora. Oftentimes the diaspora is defined as people who are outside of their homelands, whether it's from forced migration, whether it's voluntary migration or slavery. But Mario was saying, no, it's more than that. It's collective consciousness. He's saying it's having a common origin, yes, but also this resistance against repression, right, and oppression. And I think this is a particularly important point that you see throughout the text. There is this sort of underlying theme of resistance, both resistance, resilience, and also recreation. Now, the other thing that I think is particularly important about this text is this notion that Maroon communities challenge the dichotomy between the state and the state of nature, right? And this notion that Maroon communities operate really in this space between the state of, say, Jamaica and the state of nature. So it's this very interesting conversation that Maroon communities are having, both with the formalized modern state as well as the state of nature, right? The positive relationship that they have with nature, which I think is a particularly important point. Then the other thing that I thought was really significant was how Mario tied the cultural connections between Maroon communities and African communities, right? And focused a bit on Ghana. And the three things that stood out to me was land tenure, right? This is important to think about how land tenure manifests in Maroon communities and how it manifests on the African continent. Belief systems is also something that I think is particularly important, which is often not tangible, right? So when we think about culture, we often think about drumming and dancing and what food we eat, but this notion of belief systems transitioning from the African continent to the diaspora, really transcending global Africa, I thought was a dynamic piece. And then of course, art. And then something that I thought was interesting, which other colleagues may point to, is the Cromanti being influenced by Chi. And oftentimes when we think about the Maroons, we often don't think about the language in which they speak. The other thing that I think is interesting about this influence is that much like in places across the continent, Mario pointed to the next generation or the contemporary generation losing the basis of Cromanti, right? And if we look across research and literature on language across Ghana, across the continent, and really throughout the diaspora, we hear these complaints about, generations losing their understanding of their indigenous or local or cultural languages, right? And what does that do to a Maroon's understanding of their relationship to the African continent is a particularly important thing to think through as we're having conversations around this text, right? And then the next thing, I have 3 minutes left. The next thing that I thought was particularly important is the notion of being African through ancestry, right? And we know that Kwame Nkrumah said, I'm an African not because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me, right? And this notion that Africanity, whether you're on the continent or off the continent, you're African through an ancestor, right? I think this is both a metaphysical analysis and understanding of being an African, as well as a physical and biological understanding of being an African. It also raises questions about who is an African, how we identify Africans, and also this conversation about the divide between Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora. One would ask, how far is this divide if we're thinking about being an African through an ancestor? And then I have 3 more key points that I'll tackle in my 2 minutes and 10 seconds. What I think is also interesting is that Mario says the Maroons' critical practice and ideology serve as a source of their African ancestry. And for me, that's something that is just boom, straight away. It's clear, this notion of critical practice, right? Not just practice, but critical practice and ideology serves as a source of African ancestry. And when we think about this notion of, particularly in the Pan-African movement, practice and theory and practice is particularly important, right? So this notion that Maroon communities and societies are practicing African understandings of the relationship between them and the environment, for example, or them and the state, for example, as well as having sort of an ideological alignment to Pan-Africanism and the African continent, really is a source of their African ancestry. And to me, that's dynamic. And then something else that I thought, wow, this is amazing, is Kojo Day. And Kojo Day is likened to, which was likened in the book, to Panifest. One can also liken it to Emancipation Day, this notion of freedom and self-determination. And according to the text, Kojo Day has been celebrated for many years. I mean, not 5, but many, many years. And the importance of one, continuing to name this day Kojo Day, I think, is particularly important, and it talks about the connections across space and time. And then lastly, this question of sovereignty. What is sovereignty? Who defines sovereignty? And what relationship do sovereign Maroon communities have to the Jamaican government, for example, right? And I'm glad, Mario, you brought up the bank, because I thought that was such an innovative way to control one's resources, right? But then there's the question of sovereignty, right? And what relationship do we have? What relationship do Maroons have to the Jamaican government? And lastly, in my 1 second left, the question about roads and infrastructure was raised in the book. So the question becomes, if you're sovereign, does the Jamaican state still have a responsibility to supply those things, or can you be sovereign and still have a relationship to the state of Jamaica? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frehiwot. Over to you now, Dr. Adotey. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Adomako, Ampofo, and Mario, for this very great piece. I think that the work is a very well-researched one and a well-written one, which draws on multiple primary sources to make its case. The work, as it points out, is situated within diaspora and Maroon studies, and I will highly recommend this work for academics or anybody interested in understanding the workings of the diaspora, or particularly how diaspora is conceptualized and expressed. Since it's already given details of what the work is about and its argument, I will just move straight to some of the things that I think are particularly compelling about the work and certain questions I have regarding the work. I think among many of the strengths of the book is its accessibility in simple language and its simple structure. The work is so simple that once you pick it up, it's difficult to stop reading it. I basically read through it within a day, and I think it's a good one. Some materials are so heavy to read that it takes forever for you to appreciate what the contents are. And basically, he starts off by defining the 3 arguments, which I think are very important because that sets the tone for the work. That is the whole notion of collective consciousness, common origin, and objection. And he uses this lens to understand how the Maroons in Jamaica express their diaspora connections to these 3 issues: collective consciousness, common origin, and objection. And for me, I think another strength of the book is the primary sources that Mario uses in his work. By relying on these primary sources, especially voices of the people who are in those spaces, we get to hear the people speaking from themselves. So you hear the leadership, especially talking about what it means for them to be Africans, or what African consciousness means to them, which for me is very important, because sometimes when we read some of these materials, we hear more of the author's voice than the subjects that the author seeks to investigate. And I think this was brilliantly done in the work. Another issue I also found very interesting was the question of the role of the Maroons and their changing conceptions of what African origin is or was, how it's moved from being pure African to a hybrid of Amerindian and African origins that I found very fascinating. And I'm sure along the line, Mario will explain to us what accounts for this shift from being a pure African origin thing to a hybrid Amerindian, particularly Arawak and African origins. These notwithstanding, I thought that the work could have benefited from some aspects, especially when I talk about the voices. Looking at the work and the sources, it seems to overly rely on the political leadership, that is the elite. So most of the quotes we find in the work are drawn from the colonels and the assistants or the political leadership or the various ministers within Ampofo. And I thought that if we had heard the voices of the ordinary people as well, especially, for example, maybe practitioners or who be our command play, just ordinary members of the communities who have participated in the festivals, I thought that would have been a bit more balanced to let us appreciate what is going on in people's minds when they talk about African origins and their connectedness to the continent and all that. But that notwithstanding, at least it gives us an insight into what some people within the community think about these issues that Mario tries to address in his work. Secondly, I think that the idea of collective consciousness should have been fleshed out a bit, because looking at the controversy or should I say the contestations around the history of the Maroons, especially their role during the slave trade, during slavery, when as part of the agreement, we're supposed to return slaves, runaway slaves, or put down slave rebellions. It's important that we unpack what we mean by collective consciousness. So when the Maroons talk about collective consciousness, and we're talking about objection and all that, what role can we say that the Maroons also played doing this? Because if these are a group of people who through resistance and fights and whatever have been able to achieve their independence, why is it that if they are talking about collective African consciousness, they'll be on the other side trying to return other Africans into slavery? So when they talk about collective consciousness, what exactly are they talking about? Who belongs to that collective and who is outside it? Because I think this is very integral to the question of when we say African identity, how do people construct it? When they say us and them, who belongs to the us and who is them? Interestingly, in the footnote in chapter 5, one of the colonels is supposed to have referred to the other Jamaicans as Negro slaves. And Mario says that he doubts that Colonel Colley used that phrase. Now, my question is, why does he think he wouldn't have used that phrase? Considering the history and the tensions between the Maroons and the other Jamaicans of African descent. That is why I think it would have been important to fully flesh out what the Maroons also make of other Jamaicans of African descent, and when they talk about collective African consciousness, who is within that and who is outside it. Finally, I'll just end with a couple of questions that I have for Mario. One thing that I found very fascinating within the work was this thing about objection and the Maroons going back and highlighting the Africanness to challenge this objection. I'm wondering why we don't want to go back to this same Africanness that is being depicted in a negative light, because as clearly we know across global Africa, the tendency has largely been to abandon our African ways and to embrace the European ways because of what is said about our ways of life. So why is it that these Maroons are rather, instead of moving away from African history and culture, are rather embracing it? I'll appreciate some information on that. Now, the second question I have stems from a quote on page 1 where, Mario, you say that, quote, the existence of these Maroon communities of the African diaspora has clearly disproved a particular European modernist view of Black peoples by validating the pernicious idea of Africans and their descendants as being complicit in slavery and unable to govern themselves. I'm interested in how you juxtapose that within the context of the treaty that was signed between the Windward and the Leeward Maroons with the British in the 30s, which of course, like I pointed out earlier, includes returning runaway slaves into slavery. So are we interested in you clarifying that? Finally, I appreciate that you say the way that your work is not to basically establish the authenticity of some of the claims that are made by these Maroons. But as a historian and knowing how we cherish so-called facts, I'm curious, would it have made any difference? For instance, as I'm sure you also know, the role of Asante in the slave trade, and as the records show, they were more of exporters than being a source of slaves. So with all this thing about they tracing their roots to Asante, when some records show that largely some people did not come from Asante, but rather from other parts of the country and northern parts particularly. Would this change anything if these people were to understand this history and know that that was not really the case? Would they feel anything, that kind of attachment they feel to Asante? Again, that is also linked to the question of why it is that they were trying to twin a Krompong with a Krompong, knowing clearly that a Krompong is not Asante, but a Krapim. So that linkage to Asante and the turnaround in course to link a Krompong to a Krompong, which is a Krapim. How do we make sense of this historical, would I say, challenge? I think all in all, it's a brilliant piece, and congratulations once again on this very great work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adotey. And I hope, Mario, that you've taken note of the questions if you would like to respond to them briefly before we go to the Q&A. And so finally, Dr. Thomas, over to you.
Okay, and I'll set a timer to make sure I'm responsible. So first, I want to begin by thanking the organizers from the Institute of Africana Studies seminar series at the University of Ghana for putting this together. Thank you to my fellow panelists for their insights, to our chair, and especially to Mario for his friendship, collegiality, and for inviting me to learn from his work. For me, who've been primarily educated in, or at least initially educated primarily in European and American philosophy and culture, right? My education in Africana studies and diaspora studies has been a community activity of engagement with colleagues, students, and friends, and independent learning. And in this case, I kind of want to salute the fact that Mario's book, which is wonderful, has helped develop my understanding of the relationship between expressive practices, community formation, and politics. I'm particularly very interested in thinking further, as Dr. Frehiwot said, with this understanding of diaspora as a condition and a form of consciousness, and the role that both play in the history of the Jamaican Maroon struggles for sovereignty beyond the bounds of the Euro-modern nation state. And I think there's something about, especially in the discussion earlier that you said that I'll get into a little bit later, about this relationship between this community and the state that'll be interesting to tease out for some comparative discussions. So to frame my comments, I want to share actually two memories of Mario that I think help understand the importance of his work for approaching diaspora as conditioned in a critical practice. The first moment is actually the end of your tenure at Susquehanna, Mario, because we met there in that first year. We come in at the same time, and because you're a visitor, we leave. And I remember the colleagues and I talked, and we wanted to throw you a going away party for you left to show you, how much we appreciate you. And I feel really bad now because I don't have as good of a memory as I want of that event. But I do remember as I was running around trying to make sure everybody had drinks and happy, a really vivid sense memory of the laughter, conversation, joy, and appreciation amongst the people in the house that day. And I remember that whenever I looked around the building, I saw Black people relaxed, expressing themselves freely in community with one another and really engaging. And it struck me that the intensity of the happiness that I saw from all of those people was significant because it exceeded, I would say, and responded to a lot of the heavy tensions and frustrations that we see on a lot of people's faces and a lot of people's bodies who worked there, right? Because we are working together as a group of Black faculty on a campus that we know that has a lot of the major problems that you see in most American universities with discrimination, racism, and Black objection, right? And also we are in a very small place, right? Which actually exercises forms of objection, both in terms of Confederate flags, the presence and actual movement freely of Klan members, and a barn emblazoned with the name of Donald Trump, right? So when Dr. Olu was toasting you at the end, I just remember looking around and seeing this appreciation and really being awed by having only known you for that year in the community, you'd become so important for us. And I think what clicks to me in reading your book and thinking about this moment is that a lot of the appreciation and love comes from the shared struggle that we all faced together as a group there, and how that manifested through our struggles, not just our celebrations, but also the struggles we had as we worked together as colleagues. And the second, I think, was the last time we actually were able to see each other in person, when Olu and I came to Ghana. We were scouting a study abroad trip for the university in Cape Coast, and wanted to bring the students there to sort of engage with the sense of their origins in the Black past, because there's a real desire for Black students to go back and see the continent. And I remember after that first day we stayed with you, you were our first stop after the university, and we did the circuit of Elmina, Cape Coast Castle, Asin Manso, and the university. And we ended the day sitting on the beach, drinking some beer and eating suya. And I remember that this felt like a really special communal moment, because we have you, a scholar who we've known for a while now, we've become colleagues, hailing from Kitson Nevis, Dr. Onifawora Olu, who was the first Black professor at the university, a Nigerian who moved to the US for graduate school and ends up working with us in Pennsylvania, and me, a Black American, US American professor from the South, who mostly moves between the US and Europe. And a lot of the conversations that day, and a lot of the camaraderie, and a lot of what I think started to inform how we thought about ourselves in that moment, had to do with our certain relationship to that space in Ghana being on the continent, bringing us together again home, right? After the various journeys that allow us to meet somewhere else, and then see each other back in the space where we sort of share this collective identity. So as I read the book, these things come to mind. And I want to say that this is why when Mario says in the Workings of Diaspora that diaspora, as Dr. Frehiwot has told us, is both the circumstance of people regarded to be outside of their homeland and deemed to be African in origin, who foster a type of unity, having to confront various forms of oppression, or more strictly, this condition that produces the shared consciousness of sameness, rooted in an idea of common African origin and based on a common experience of Black objection. That this thesis is of really immense, both intellectual, psychological, and I think political importance, because it points to diaspora as a condition that's not enforced to a certain extent, right, but taken on and exercised as a form of collective consciousness that manifests itself through expressive practices. And I like this term you use for it, which is enunciation, right, to engage in the struggle for Black freedom, sovereignty, and self-determination. So there's this link between cultural production and politics that I find super important throughout the book. And I find it really important because it's a condition insofar as it's also a commitment to expressive and political practices that assert the humanity of Black people, take up adversarial relationships with colonial formations, including in many cases the form of the nation state. So what I get from the book that I think is super important is that alignment with the diaspora isn't simply a matter of aligning oneself with African practices in the way that a lot of people, I think in the United States especially, have to deal with wrestling with identity. But it is actually a matter of practice and action. It's an existential question, whether or not somebody is involved in diaspora. And to this end, I really appreciate that you provide us with a very detailed account of the ways in which Maroons live their claims of African origin and engage in cultural practices that maintain that collective consciousness, right? I think we learned from you that the relationship of expressive practices to assertions of humanity, political sovereignty, and struggles for liberation is also this critical practice of, I would say, the aesthetic creation of a Black life world through oral histories, celebrations, spiritual practices, and metaphysics that they enact as a community as evidence of the ability to cultivate a self-understanding that has value in the world. And it's super important to see that analysis as a process rather than a state, which I think you do a really good job of presenting. I also appreciate that the practice is diasporic in the way that it allows for intersections with other communities based on their alternative articulations of a shared origin, right? So this makes sense for me in terms of identity and an argument for Black humanity, because I think it's crucial that we see how you're framing Maroon consciousness and their projects as one piece of a larger puzzle of thinking about Black consciousness or diasporic consciousness in other nations. So if we think about your work in conversation with Tiffany Florville's work on Black Germans, for example, there's a conversation to be had about the different manifestations of both culture, community, and the different political formations and concerns that come out of that I think is really, really interesting. And I also think it points to an understanding of the multifacetedness of Blackness in the diaspora based on how the way in which we articulate and enunciate our origins to the past and our collective commitment to one another will call upon same origins, but do them in a way that varies based on our routes outside of the continent and the way that we trace those back, right? So there's a common origin that allows us a bit of unity and difference that I think we often miss in some of these discussions. So with the last minute, I want to say, I think what'll be interesting to keep talking with you about, Mario, is the connection between cultural production and the production of sovereignty. Because I think as your discussion today of the relationship between communities, Maroon communities and Jamaican communities goes, right? There's a tension, even in this case, right, of political sovereignty and cultural sovereignty, and this time as an intercommunal conflict between Black communities, rather than what we would think about often in the US, which is Maroon communities or autonomous communities of Black people sort of pushing back against white societies, right? Here we really are thinking about colonial and neo-colonial structures as sort of the impetus for this type of relationship, which I think is super important. And I think where the work is promising is it does show, I think through the environmental example you gave to us today, right, that there's a way in which we can use communal and cultural claims to push back and supersede political claims in a way that actually makes a liberal or state political structure irrelevant to a certain extent, or at least subsequent to cultural claims about ancestry and land, right? So I think then the remaining question is sort of how we continue to generate those types of practices that both create and generate forms of collective consciousness and sovereignty, while also thinking about how we can deconstruct and move out of the types of frameworks that produce objection and the types of exploitation that you mentioned at the end of the text. The last thing I kind of wanted to leave us with, and I'm sorry, I'm a little over time, it feels like, is just, I think, this beautiful encapsulation of a kind of commitment that I think could guide this type of a discussion, right? Which is, you say in the conclusion, Maroons seek sovereignty from the large and overbearing logic of the rigid structure of dominant hegemonic nation states and geopolitical order, commonly critiqued as alienating. It is secession from sovereignties of post-colonial and neo-colonial states that are still under Western dominance. It's separation from an unsustainable developmentalist global order that is increasingly leading to humankind's inability to live on the planet, right? So I think when you make that a kind of commitment through that description, there's a question to ask about then what we do when we think about diasporic politics, to generate a politics and a set of values that actually breaks us from those structures, right? That breaks us from a structure that wants to protect us from a European understanding of the state of nature as a state of violence, while constantly making our global state that state of violence that they say that we're being protected from, right? What kind of communal diasporic values could maybe build different communities that stop us from being destroyed by those structures? And I look forward to hearing everything you have to say in response to a lot of questions you just got. Thank you, Mario, for the book. It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Adotey, Dr. Frehiwot, for your important interventions. Dr. Nisbett, before I let you come in, let's take a few other comments and questions from the floor, and then you can put these together. So I'll take a first round of 3. Please use the reaction button to raise your hand so that I can call you, and then we'll have Mario respond, and then we'll take a second round. We'll see how much time we have. So I'm recognizing Professor Avogbedo, Dennis Canterbury, and do we have a third? Okay, I do not see a third hand. Dennis, did you take your hand down?
Somebody logged me off, so I'm back in. Can you hear me?
Professor Avogbedo, you are here, so no problem. I don't know about Dennis. His hand was up and now it's vanished.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, but hold on a second. Professor
Okay.
Avogbedo, please hold on a second.
Sure.
Dennis Canterbury, is your hand still up? I do not see it anymore.
Yeah, my hand was up, but it's taken down. I don't know what was happening, but that's
okay.
fine.
So all right, so good. I have recognized your hand. Is there a third hand? Okay, so let's take the two of you. Prof. Avogbedo will go, Dennis Canterbury will go, and then Mario will have you respond, and then we'll take a second round. So, thank you.
Yes, I'll try to be brief and succinct, and because I do have a lot of points noted here. But the first thing is to really thank Mario Nisbett for this important addition to the literature on Maroonage in Maroon communities lately. Very important. I can begin with quickly with a few personal episodes. I used to read the Gleaner in the 80s, and inflation rate was like $7 Jamaican dollars to the American dollar. This might sound trivial, but I think there are also internal dynamics, global economics still at play. We talk about Maroon inventing their own currencies in 2000s, yes. But what is the state of that currency right now in terms of the global economy and internal politics, relational, and in terms of negotiating identities at different levels, whether it's in terms of the material, ideological, economic, or whatever it is. And quickly, I know there's a vast literature out there. Some will include the earlier ones like Catherine Dunham's Journey to Ampofo of 1946. And there are also some popularizers like Louis Bennett. And in terms of the way they contribute to the identities of the Maroon communities and the historical records, such as the book I mentioned, 1946, how has that been useful to you? And also I'm thinking of the theoretical trends or trajectories which you can make to the whole area of African diaspora studies. For example, a comparative framework seems to be lacking. You take the Palencos or the Quilombos of Brazil and the Surinamese Salamanca people. Okay, what are some of the essential areas of convergences, divergences over time and contemporary tendencies? For example, in terms of affiliation, contemporary politics of identity and affiliation, Surinamese government has actually represented the Salamancan people, the Maroon over there, with the Ghanaian government specifically, and they actually came to Ghana, delegation came, and they brought a musical instrument of African heritage, same sculpture, motif designs, and the same name, Apenten. They brought to the Asante Hennes Palace, and as a gift. In fact, I was there and I took a picture of the instrument, talking about Abeng and the Benta of Kan origins among the Maroon. So there are material sources of evidence, but these also become reinvented over time. And they can also be very potent forces for explaining the African diaspora in terms of retention theories, Africanism back and forth, whatever have you. And then finally, in terms of contribution to the larger theorization of the African diaspora and beyond, people talk about levels, types. For example, incipient diaspora, de-diasporization, re-diasporization, overlapping diasporas. I think there's something we can bring to enlighten us more on these developments in diaspora studies. I think I will end there. There are a lot more, but thank you.
Okay.
Hello.
Thank you. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nisbett, for your very important book and contribution. I haven't read all of the book myself, but I was able to read, a bit that was available to me on Google Books. I don't know why they do that, but it's important. I plan to buy a copy of your book pretty soon. But my comment is basically a simple one, and it's more sort of methodological in the sense that I noticed that you use the diaspora as an analytical tool. You said it's a useful analytical tool. So I was wondering if there is any connection between its use as an analytical tool and its use as a unit of analysis, if there's a difference between the two things, and if so, how would you explain that? So that was my short little comment question. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, I'll start. Thank you for all your questions. I start with Dr. Adotey. Comments and statements in terms of response. I thought they were good questions, all good questions. The first part you were asking about the shifting in terms of identity with the Maroons. So this would give me some time because with the presentation, I wanted to make it as short as possible. So I skipped over some of the details that I could have explored some more a bit in the work. So the Maroons, so what I try to do in terms of the work is I'm looking and focusing on Maroons' practice of diaspora. So this idea of the practice of diaspora, I wanted to explore, and live in this diaspora I want to explore. It's in many ways is something that is relatively recent. In some ways of they positioning themselves or reinventing themselves in a particular way versus how they were viewed, how they saw themselves in the past. So they have different time periods where Maroons, so the Maroons emerge, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, they emerged during the Spanish colonial period in Jamaica, and also during when the British came in 1555. They also continued that resistance, but new groups emerged, sometimes groups merge and mix, during that time period. And there have been some DNA tests done in terms of the Maroons' origin. And so there have DNA tests that show that they actually have a small amount of indigenous blood in the Maroons people. And the Maroons, it depends on who they are speaking to and the argument that they're making, but I'm also looking at how they are practicing or performing this idea of diaspora, because at certain times they would say that we are indigenous and we were here in Jamaica before the Spanish came. So sometimes it's before the British came. We were here in Jamaica before the British came. We were here in Jamaica before the Spanish came, linking themselves to the land, going back to the indigenous people as a means of challenging the state. So the community actually used, depending on the time and the leadership, they would use different ways of identifying themselves based on what particular argument they are trying to push at that particular time. So they had a period where indigenous people were considered inferior and completely in a sense, like less than quote unquote Black people. So the Maroons would argue that they have no indigenous blood at all. And then another time Maroons would argue that they are, that they have no indigenous blood and they are pure African. And then other times they would argue that they have indigenous blood based on their argument. But for me, I was looking at how they really perform this idea of diaspora. Because as I think the last, second to last presenter, Prof. Daniel said, in terms of the diaspora, like they could actually de-link themselves from diaspora if they want to, or if they see a need to. So it's complicated, and the issue of overlapping diaspora I would come to in a minute. So this is a paper work, and the issue of Maroons enslaving, returning Africans. It's a big issue in Jamaica too sometimes, where people refer to the Maroons as traitors. And how do you sustain this narrative of, you are the first independent community, and and those things. And when you go to the Maroon and you ask the Maroons, you return enslaved Africans, their response would be, it's not true. That's not true. Where do you have the evidence that we return enslaved Africans? It's not true. They would deny. And when you push further to find out more, and this is an incident. One time I went to a Maroon celebration. They have 4 different Maroon communities. And so I went to a particular Maroon celebration with other groups of Maroons in attendance and other people in attendance. And there was an elder that drank a bit. And so he was, something came up, and the question came up of like, why did you return enslaved Africans that tried to leave the plantation? And his response was, because he said it's because it's in the treaty. That's what was his response. And the other Maroons that were there, they would say, because they were talking about a particular incident. I think it was it Paul Bogle or it was Taki? I'm not sure which individual they were referring to at that particular time. But the other Maroons would say, it's not us. Maybe that Maroon group did it, but our Maroon group didn't do that. And you would see some of this happening, but also I talk about it a little bit in the text too, when the Maroons speak of the treaty itself. So the treaty itself, the treaty itself was the origins of the treaty that was supposedly signed by the Jamaican Maroons. There were two treaties in Jamaica, and the Maroons were also highlighted depending on how well versed they are with the history of the society. So the first treaty was signed with Kojo, then the second treaty was signed with Kwaku, another group, the Windward Maroons and the Leeward Maroons. So they had 2 different treaties. And within these groups, they had different Maroon groups within these 2 broader groups of Maroon community that signed the treaty, or supposedly signed the treaty. When you look at Maroon tradition or Maroon history, they would tell you about a blood treaty. They would speak about a blood treaty that was an agreement between them and the British. And so the treaty was an oral agreement, and the Maroons would argue that, and they would tell you that the white man had to cut his vein, cut his wrist, and pour the blood into a calabash bowl, a bowl with some herbs, and the black man, Kojo, had to also cut his wrist, and the blood would be poured into the calabash bowl. And they made an agreement, and both had to drink the ingredients that was created as a form of signing, making an agreement. And one of the Maroon oral tradition has that after signing the treaty, Kojo was leaving, and the British colonel or general said, we are not finished. And he said that we have to sign the agreement. And the Maroon oral tradition said basically the Maroons gave the colonel a long lecture about, we don't need to sign the agreement, we just made an agreement. We will teach our children the agreement, and we expect you to do the same thing too. So we don't need to sign basically agreement to prove that what we have done really exists. From their point of view, the agreement was in that act that they did, that oath that we took. And the agreement that was made, the Maroons don't have it in written documents, but the essence of the agreement, they felt that it was made that they agreed to stop the fighting. They agreed to be autonomous from the Maroons' perspective. They agreed that they would be autonomous and the British would be autonomous. But if either side need help, both sides could come to each other for assistance and help. So when the Maroons, when people talk about the written treaty, the Maroons actually, if you go deep into it, some Maroons will show this is the treaty agreement. And they will tell you that this is the treaty agreement, but some Maroons will tell you that's not actually the real agreement. The real agreement was the blood treaty that we signed, that we agreed to. And what they have in the written treaty actually is not what they agreed to. And also to other scholars have brought this up too. The fact that Kojo, is believed that Kojo was born on the continent, and the fact that he might have spoken English, but he wasn't a, he wasn't a legal scholar in English. And we don't know if he even knew how to read and write English. So, so these kind of agreements that was made, like exactly what happened there. For the Maroons, they focused on the blood treaty, what was agreed in oath. And the British government themselves, they talk about the agreement that was made. They talk about a strange ceremony, but they didn't go into detail what the strange ceremony was. They just said it was a strange ceremony. But then before the agreement was fully typed up and approved, the British government changed the agreement. They didn't say what they changed, but they did say they changed some things in the agreement. And so they made a change unilaterally, even though they came together to sign a treaty. They made the change. So for the Maroons, there are 3 things in the document that they really think is completely false and not true. And that has to do in terms of returning enslaved Africans. That has to do in terms of the land and in terms of leadership. Those are the 3 things. But when you look at Maroon oral tradition, you see evidence of Maroons returning enslaved Africans. And you have 2 Maroon communities that were started by the Leeward Maroons. It was Kojotong and Akampongtong. And when Kojotong had a dispute with the British government, the Akampong Maroon actually ended up siding with the British government that actually eventually destroyed the other Maroon community that was in Kojotong. And it becomes complicated because what happened during the colonial period is not often talked about much. People talk about that Maroons should apologize because of what happened in terms of returning Africans, but Maroons also too, when you speak to them, and I feel like I'm going on too long with this, when you speak to them, they will tell you too that we fought the British for 80 years. 80 years we fought the British, and we are asking other Africans to come, join us, help us fight against the Europeans. And for them, enslaved Africans were some of the people coming after them, in their argument. Enslaved Africans were coming after them. Free Africans were coming after them. And sometimes they even could get other Maroon groups to come after them, like how the society was structured. So how the society was structured, everybody was supposed to come against any group that tried to escape slavery. White, black, free, enslaved, all of the groups were encouraged to do so. And we don't hear also arguments of people saying Black people should apologize to other Black people because they also had, there wasn't any real period of time where other enslaved Africans weren't used to hunt down other enslaved Africans. And there wasn't a period of time where Africans also enslaved other Africans in the Americas. So it becomes complex, and the idea, the Maroons will tell you, the idea of a Black identity didn't emerge much later, the idea of who we are. And then also to some other scholars have brought this out. The conflict that was happening in Ghana and the Gold Coast with Ashanti, Achem, the different group, Akwamu, the different groups that had conflict, those conflicts actually, they even came over into the Americas, where they have evidence of groups of people from Ghana actually who were Maroons wipe out other groups who were Maroons, because some of the conflict on the continent itself, where one group was responsible for another group being enslaved in the Americas, and when that group got weaker, another group is able to send over people from that very group that enslaved the group before. So there were some of these things happening in the Americas that made the issues much more complex, that it's not always straightforward, where the Maroons, yes, they were involved in terms of capturing people who ran away, but also too, there's evidence in the British documents that Maroons would go and the people who maybe other enslaved people kill, the people who the European killed, they would say the Maroons would get their dead bodies and basically take their ears off and go to the British and say, oh, we kill all of these people. And there are also episodes of Maroons actually keeping enslaved Africans in their community away from the British. So it had a lot to, some of it has a lot to do with the politics of the time, what Maroon felt about outside individuals coming to their community. So, like, will they adhere to? We have, for them, there's evidence in Jamaica where Maroon groups invited people in their community, and those people were the people that eventually led to the collapse or the destruction of their communities. So there's a lot of things that was going on during the time period, and that makes the issue complex. And the Maroons made mistakes, I think, like other groups did. And they didn't always view themselves as people of African descent, or even always connect with Africa. Sometimes some Maroons would deny the African connections. Some would, support the African connection. So in terms of Carly, so in terms of what Carly said in the newspaper, you mentioned Carly, one of the former chief, Colonel Carly. He said that when the British left, they gave the land over to their Negro slaves. I said I don't think he said that because of the time period and the Maroons' effort to connect with people of African descent during this time period. It was in the, I think, the 80s. I think it was highly unlikely, but it's also to the Gleaner, the newspaper, the Gleaner. The Gleaner was founded in 1834, the same year slavery was outlawed. But the Gleaner itself, I mean, it's oftentimes side with the British government in terms of when it examined Maroon community. If you look through the colonial period, it's very, very colonial based. It's description of African people, its description of Maroons is very racist and from a British perspective. Even later on in the post-colonial period, that racism was removed because African people were able to give in position. But they sometimes have people who are part of the company that don't always agree or identify with the Maroons. So sometimes some information I've seen in the paper are misinformation about Maroon communities. I've noticed in the paper. So that's why I question whether or not he said that statement. So you mentioned also to why turn to Africa. So this is important in terms of why are they turning to Africa? For Maroon communities, one other thing too in terms of Africa and connection to Africa, oftentimes the diaspora, when they're making connection to the continent, it has more to do with the community itself, trying to improve their standing within the state or the society that they're in. And so the idea of Africa is maybe romantic, or the idea of Africa is used as a means to improve their condition. So many of them are not aware of the issues on the continent in terms of Africans saying, oh, we should be following Europeans more versus whether we should go back to our African past. In a lot of people's minds in the diaspora, their idea is that Africa had a great past and they could also have a great future, even though they're going through struggles now. So for people in the diaspora and people in the Caribbean, oftentimes the model is like, do we go the way of Africans or do we go the way of the European? And so the idea is that we go to the way of the African, even though maybe some Africans are not necessarily agreeing to that idea. So let me, so yes, so I think I addressed everything in terms of Maroon's challenge to governing. So I think the Maroon challenge in many ways challenge the idea of governing, but they also play a contradictory role sometimes. Like it's not clear that they always be in a particular way. They have used different ways to position themselves in the society. And in terms of Dr. Thomas in connection, Michael, in terms of connection between cultural production and sovereignty, is an issue I'm still grappling with in many ways of looking at cultural production and issue of sovereignty, because in Maroon communities, you also have the issue of the idea of tourism, like, the idea of tourism and capitalism and how do we bring resources into our community? And is this display of African identity, is it about resources and surviving in a capitalist country and capitalist Western Hemisphere. So in the Maroon community, there isn't always a clear line where the land belongs to the ancestors and the children, but they have members of the community who will be willing to do certain things, like willing to do mining, willing to do certain things in the community, which is not always in agreement with the broader ideology of the community, but it still exists there. There is tension and there's disagreement in terms of what is the way forward for Maroon communities. In terms of Prof. Daniel, in terms of you mentioned the currency and Catherine Dunham. So the currency, quickly, with the currency and the bank, the Maroons established, some leaders in the Maroon community established a bank and they established a currency. So the currency itself, it's a very controversial issue where some people in the community were saying, oh, it's not right for us to create this currency, because where is the backing of the currency is coming from? They have a lot of dispute among the community about the currency and the bank itself. The new administration that came into Ampofo actually dissolve that bank and move away from the use of the currency, because he argues that it wasn't properly done, and there's some issue in terms of how the current administration has some issues with how the previous administration run take care of the affairs of the communities. In terms of Catherine Dunham, I think I mentioned her in the work. But she came, I think she was there in the 1940s, and she written a book about it, her experiences there. And, her experiences there. And, and for the most part, the Maroon communities, they connected or identified with the African continent, but it wasn't as it is today. Like in the 1940s, the connection is there somehow, but it's not as strong as it is today. But back then, they probably had more what we refer to as African cultural retention in the community, more in terms of their spiritual practice. So the work didn't so much, I thought about doing a comparative framework of Maroon community, but the work I wanted to really focus on the working of diaspora and applying it to this particular community, and see how it works, rather than perhaps look at the other Maroon communities. The other Maroon communities it varies. Like a colleague of mine, Rob Connell, he looks at the Maroon community in Jamaica and actually in Suriname. And for the Maroon communities, they're actually pushing for inclusion in the state more, and representation in the state. They had a war with the state in the 1990s where many Maroons were killed in the war, but now they are pushing for more inclusion in the states, and it's a different dynamics in the different Maroon communities in terms of how they would engage diaspora, how they would in turn engage issues of sovereignty. And yes, and so the issue of diaspora and connecting and unconnecting. So there's the issue of overlapping diaspora, also mentioned in the work, where the Maroon community could also, they identify with the African diaspora, but they could also identify with the Jamaican diaspora. They could identify with, different diasporas. And so identifying with one diaspora doesn't contradict is not mutually exclusive in a sense. So they could identify with other diaspora. And in terms of the last point, in terms of Dr. Dennis, in terms of unit analysis and analytical tool, actually I have to think about that a bit some more. I was looking at it mainly as an analytical tool. In terms of unit of analysis, I have to think about that a bit more. And I thank you for raising that point. So I will end here. I think I'm speaking way too much, and I'll end here.
Thank you, Mario, for all those responses. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to bring the curtain down. We are slightly over our time, but I think that we've had a very edifying afternoon. We could go on, having this conversation, linking it to other diasporas. I am myself keen on thinking about linkages to the South Asian diaspora, Africans in South Asia. You know, this conversation could go in very many interesting ways, but let me bring the curtain down and thank you so much, Dr. Nisbett, for sharing this work with us. I am very sure that you are giving, if you have not already done, a copy of your book to the IAS library. Thank you very much. And maybe to one or two of our colleagues who teach, I guess, in the philosophy section or the history and politics section, you know, for our teaching. I think that this will be an excellent text for, you know, especially for our graduate program. Thank you to our discussants. Thank you to those of you who posed questions. Thank you to all of you who came. And please come to our next seminar as well. And just watch this space. Thank you, of course, always to Dr. Mba for so elegantly and generously, you know, navigating and curating our seminars. Thank you all, and have a wonderful afternoon. And those of you who are on campus, we have an interesting inaugural lecture in a couple of hours, Professor Audrey Gajepo on the advocacy, activism, and the media. So I'm sure that you would all benefit from attending that as well. So have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Mba, any closing comments from you before we leave?
Not quite, just to thank you for helping out with chairing this event and of course supporting our event as you usually do. And for Mario, thank you so much for eventually being able to come here for this event. We'll come back with another very interesting seminar, something on methodology. You know, about 2 weeks. Do look out for the circulation of the posters. And then for those of us, okay, everyone is online today. So if you like to unmute just 1 minute to say hi to maybe the Mario or some other friends here, maybe congratulations to him, and then we can just end the meeting.
Mario, Aiko.
Mario.
Thanks, Mario.
Good to see you.
Aiko to you and to all the discussants.
Thanks, Mario.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good, Mario.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Hey, thanks, Mario, from all the way from St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Island.
Thank you. That's my dad. Thank you, Dad.
Well, we are trying our best. It's not in person, so Mario, people cannot come to you. We cannot have that kind of conversation we normally have after. But
Chika, you owe him some palm wine the next time you meet.
He's actually in person, so he was going to get it right away.
Okay, good. Mario, I think you should hold him to that.
I will.
So we are ending recording.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay.